It was supposed to pressure Canada. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, potash, a trade move designed to assert American leverage in negotiations and demonstrate a tough stance. The goal was clear: to create economic pain that would, in theory, compel Canada to change its policies or make concessions. But while Washington expected a straightforward economic hit, expecting retaliatory measures or resistance, something unexpected unfolded. Instead of conflict, what emerged was resistance through reinvention. The response across Canada wasn't loud or confrontational. It was smart, strategic, and deeply transformative. Consumers began changing their habits quietly but effectively. Exporters found new markets beyond the United States, and factories began retooling to meet the demands of these new opportunities. Investors redirected their capital, and policymakers adapted their strategies in real time. What started as a punitive measure, tariffs, gradually morphed into a blueprint for resilience. Canada didn't just survive the tariffs, it leveraged them as a catalyst for profound change. The country underwent a quiet but powerful shift in mindset, supply chain dynamics, and economic identity. What was initially perceived as a setback became a strategic turning point. Today, the question isn't whether Canada has recovered from those tariffs. Rather, it's whether the United States underestimated its closest neighbor's capacity for adaptation and growth. This story isn't about politics alone. It's about strategy, reaction, and transformation. Sometimes the most profound changes aren't made through protests or loud opposition. They're made through deliberate preparation and strategic response. The tariffs, intended as a blunt instrument of economic pressure, inadvertently became a catalyst for Canada to reinvent itself. Through resilience and ingenuity, Canada turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity to build strength, agility, and independence. Let's explore how one trade decision, initially perceived as punitive, may have ultimately helped Canada become stronger than ever before. When the tariffs hit in early 2025, Canadians didn't respond with protests or political outrage. Instead, they took to the shelves, shifting their shopping habits in subtle yet impactful ways. Major retailers like Sobeys, Metro, and Loblaws quietly reduced shelf space for U.S. imports, prioritizing Canadian-made products. The focus was not on grand announcements, but on a deliberate, consistent messaging, highlighting products of Canada with quiet pride and strategic intent. Consumers responded quickly. Within just 60 days, Statistics Canada reported that imports of American-made consumer goods had dropped by over 17%. This decline stemmed not only from price hikes caused by tariffs, but also from a deeper cultural shift, a pivot driven by economic logic, national pride, and a desire for self-sufficiency. By August 2025, a survey conducted by Ipsos revealed that 64% of Canadians actively avoided U.S. brands whenever local alternatives were available. Dairy, produce, cleaning supplies, even craft beer, demand for Canadian-made products surged across sectors. The federal government supported this movement through campaigns like Choose Canadian, coupled with tax incentives for local producers. Small businesses scaled up their operations, forming cooperatives and regional supply networks that reinforced local supply chains. Buying Canadian was no longer a momentary reaction, but a movement, an expression of economic resilience and national identity. For many Canadians, this shift signified more than patriotism. It marked a strategic redefinition of their relationship with their economy, emphasizing participation, quality, and self-reliance. In a world of global disruptions, it became clear that Canada's stability was rooted in participation in its own economy rather than dependence on external markets. Simultaneously, Canada undertook a strategic overhaul of its export landscape. Historically, about 75% of Canadian exports flowed southward to the United States, creating a deep but risky dependency. When tariffs disrupted this traditional route in 2025, alarm bells sounded across Ottawa's trade offices. But rather than react defensively, Canada pivoted swiftly. Trade officials activated dormant agreements and reignited diplomatic channels beyond the US border. The Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement set a was revitalized, opening new avenues for exports to Europe. By the second quarter of 2025, exports to the European Union had increased by 11.2%, driven by agricultural products, green technology, and rare earth minerals. Under the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, shipments to countries like Japan, Vietnam, and Singapore surged, especially in food processing, timber, and electric vehicle components. New export routes emerged. Goods that once flowed primarily to Michigan and Ohio now headed toward Hamburg and Yokohama. This wasn't merely logistical rerouting. It was a strategic redefinition of Canada's role in global trade. The country began acting less as a regional supplier and more as a global player. The government provided grants and incentives to mid-sized firms to explore new markets, expanded digital trade platforms, and dispatched trade missions across South America, Southeast Asia, and the Gulf states. Behind this effort was a clear message from Ottawa. Never again should one customer, particularly the United States, dominate 75% of our trade. This wasn't about abandoning the US, it was about diversifying and adding options. In the global economy of 2025, flexibility isn't a luxury. It's a necessity for survival. Addressing vulnerabilities in domestic production was another critical element of Canada's response. The tariffs, while punitive, exposed weaknesses, over-reliance on US factories and supply chains that made the country vulnerable to external shocks. Instead of patching these cracks, Canada chose to rebuild from within. The federal government committed over 28 billion Canadian dollars to bolster domestic manufacturing in key sectors. New facilities for electric vehicle batteries, rare earth processing, and semiconductor packaging broke ground across Ontario and Quebec. Investments flowed into Alberta and Saskatchewan for agricultural processing and mineral refining, aiming to shorten supply chains and reduce dependency on cross-border trade. Companies such as Magna, Linear, and Ballard Power shifted sourcing strategies to prioritize Canadian inputs, while small businesses formed cooperative buying groups and regional distribution networks. Interprovincial trade, long hindered by bureaucratic hurdles, began to open up through targeted reforms. In July 2025, Industry Canada announced an ambitious goal: reduce foreign input reliance by 40% by the end of 2026. This was a comprehensive effort to produce smarter, closer to home, with greater control over supply chains. Canada didn't isolate itself, it strengthened itself through inward-focused resilience. These efforts built a foundation capable of withstanding future disruptions, whether geopolitical, environmental, or economic, turning what could have been a crisis into an opportunity for long-term growth. Small and medium-sized enterprises played a crucial role in this transformation. While policies and government initiatives set the stage, it was the entrepreneurs, those on the ground, who drove the change. As tariffs increased costs and disrupted supply chains, local entrepreneurs spotted new opportunities. From food producers to clothing manufacturers and eco-friendly packaging startups, Canadian small and mid-sized businesses stepped into the gaps left by reduced US imports. Supported by targeted grants, zero-interest loans, and the Choose Canadian campaign, these businesses didn't just survive, they scaled rapidly. Platforms like Shopify reported record onboarding of Canadian sellers between May and August 2025. Local grocery stores increased shelf space for regional products, and demand for Canadian-made brands surged in sectors like craft foods, personal care, and home goods. This wasn't just about buying local. It was about creating a self-sustaining feedback loop. Every dollar spent on Canadian goods helped a small business grow, which in turn reinforced domestic supply chains, created jobs, and fostered innovation. Unlike large multinational corporations that often take years to adapt, these small businesses moved quickly, reconfiguring their operations, connecting with new customers, and delivering products faster than anyone expected. Their agility proved invaluable in turbulent markets, turning them into an economic multiplier that amplified the country's resilience. Meanwhile, the story of investment was quietly shifting. While headlines focused on tariffs and trade disputes, a different narrative was unfolding in boardrooms and investment firms. Capital was increasingly flowing northward. Between May and July 2025, Canada attracted over $12 billion in new foreign direct investment, according to the OECD. Why? Because amid global uncertainty, Canada offered something increasingly rare: stability. Its policies were consistent, its institutions trusted, and its response to economic pressures strategic rather than reactive. Green energy, electric vehicle manufacturing, artificial intelligence, logistics, and clean technology became top targets for international investors, especially from Germany, South Korea, and Japan. Major funds shifted their allocations from US-centric ETF into Canadian infrastructure and industrial assets. Sovereign wealth funds, which had traditionally focused on American real estate and tech, began eyeing Canadian renewables and transportation projects. Even credit rating agencies took note. While the US faced warnings of downgrade, Canada's R+ rating held firm. This wasn't a matter of emotion or nationalism. It was about strategy, predictability, and long-term upside. In a world where capital seeks certainty, Canada became an unexpected safe haven. Its reputation as a reliable, stable destination for investment grew, and the numbers bore this out. Supply chain trust played a critical role in this shift. Global buyers weren't just looking for the cheapest options anymore. They sought reliability, consistency, and security. As US tariffs disrupted long-established trade flows, Canada quietly positioned itself as a trusted alternative, an anchor of stability in a fragile global market. European and Asian manufacturers in automotive, electronics, and agriculture sectors began rerouting their supply chains through Canadian ports and suppliers. Infrastructure investments like the expansion of Halifax and Vancouver ports, alongside streamlined customs processes through initiatives like the Single Windows System, made international shipping through Canada smoother and more reliable than ever. Even American firms with global operations began shifting component sourcing through Canadian partners to bypass tariff-related delays. By mid-2025, several European logistics networks officially reclassified Canada as a primary, non-disruption corridor, a status previously reserved for top-tier Asian hubs. This was not about size or military strength. It was about trust. Trust, in a fragile global economy, moves products, contracts, and capital. Canada didn't outproduce everyone. It outperformed on consistency and reliability. When the world needed a stable node in its disrupted supply chain, Canada showed up, ready, dependable, and resilient. The impact of the 2025 US tariffs extended far beyond immediate trade figures. They became an unintended but effective training camp for Canada's economy. Almost overnight, policymakers, producers, and exporters confronted long-standing inefficiencies. Bureaucratic delays were digitized within months, and customs processes were streamlined. Interprovincial trade, hindered for decades by bureaucratic red tape, was accelerated through reforms and agreements. The urgency created momentum, not chaos. Policies that had been lingering in planning stages, like tax reforms and transport subsidies, were implemented swiftly, giving local businesses the tools to adapt and thrive. Manufacturers received grants to retool factories, not just for domestic needs, but for meeting global standards. The focus was on building an agile, adaptable economy, one better prepared for future shocks, whether geopolitical, environmental, or economic. This wasn't a crisis, it was a training ground for resilience. Canada didn't fold under pressure. It recalibrated, transforming setbacks into opportunities for long-term strength. The outcome was a more dynamic, flexible, and resilient economy, one rooted in strategic planning, innovation, and collective effort. All of this contributed to a profound shift in Canadian national identity. For years, Canada's global image was shaped by quiet diplomacy and close ties with the United States. But when tariffs disrupted that relationship, a deeper transformation took place. Economic pride emerged, not in a loud or nationalistic way, but in a confident, deliberate manner. Canadians began to value what was made at home: not merely for its origin, but for its quality, reliability, and its role in national resilience. Campaigns like Choose Canadian weren't about rejection, they were about recognition, acknowledging that Canadian innovation, products, and systems could compete on the world stage. Globally, Canada's newfound confidence gained traction. Canadian branding, once seen as a friendly alternative to American products, now gained recognition as a symbol of quality and dependability. Tech startups in Toronto, clean energy initiatives in Quebec, and precision agriculture in the prairies became case studies of innovation and resilience. This shift in self-perception translated into strategic confidence abroad. Canada was no longer just a quiet partner. It was a capable, competitive peer, an industrial and economic powerhouse in its own right. And that mindset mattered because in 2025, resilience wasn't just about rebuilding industries. It was about redefining national identity. For the United States, the ripple effects are just beginning to be felt. Prices on goods like lumber, aluminum, and auto parts are creeping upward, not solely from inflation, but because Canadian suppliers now prioritize other markets. For decades, the US relied on Canada as a stable, affordable source for raw materials and finished goods. But in 2025, that balance shifted. Canadian producers now have options Europe, Asia, and within Canada itself, reducing dependence on American buyers. For American consumers, this means fewer bargains and longer delays on goods that once crossed the border effortlessly. For American businesses, it means rethinking supply chains that once relied on Canada as a backup. Even US investors are beginning to move capital northward, seeking opportunities in Canadian sectors insulated from Washington's volatility. This isn't a collapse, it's a correction, a recalibration of economic ties. The message is clear: Canada will no longer be taken for granted. As it becomes a more self-sufficient global player, the US may find itself on the outside looking in, watching as others follow Canada's lead, learning from its strategic responses, and perhaps even trying to emulate its resilience. Canada's economic response in 2025 wasn't just noticed, it's being studied worldwide. Countries facing similar trade pressures, Australia, the United Kingdom, smaller economies like New Zealand and Denmark, are now exploring resilience-first strategies inspired by Canada's example.